Didn't want to forget to do that. All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Hi. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Heather Kowalski, the director of the Bidwell House Museum. Thanks for being here tonight to learn a little bit more about the museum's forestry plans. Before we begin, I just want to note a couple things. So just make sure to keep yourself muted during the presentation, but you're welcome to leave your camera on if you want. That's completely up to you. We will be recording, as you saw, you might have heard. We're recording the discussion, and I'm hoping to have it up on our website by next week so that you can watch it if you have to leave early. And we will also be taking questions at the end. So if you have questions, type them into the chat box, or and I can ask them of Peter, Adam, or Tom at the end, or just go ahead and use the raise hand feature when we get to that part at the end after the presentations. So tonight we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. First up will be Tom Ryan, a service forester with the Department of Conservation and Recreation and a Bidwell board member, who's going to provide an overview of our forest stewardship plan. Let me go to the next slide here. Come on. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it to go to the next slide. Now it's not. Oh, there we go. Okay. So Tom will be up first to talk, to do the overview. And then after the following Tom, you'll hear from Peter Tucker and Adam Brown, who are consulting foresters that the museum's been working with for the last few years, who will explain the potential cutting plan and logistics. And before I pass this over to Tom, I do want to read the land acknowledgement from the Stockbridge-Muncie community. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship and being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And now I'm happy to pass it over to Tom Ryan.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Well, thanks for coming today. As Heather said, I am a service forester for Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I'm also a board member. I've been involved with the Bidwell House since about 2009 when I started working in this area. And then I moved right down the road in 2013, and they invited me to become a board member, and have since worked with them on a number of forestry projects. And I guess one thing I want to put out there, first and foremost, is I feel like since I'm on the board, I'm a little too close in the sense of doing my official state service forester duties of reviewing cutting plans. And so I've actually going to be having a counterpart of mine do the official review and stepping back from that. But as an overview, the Bidwell House Museum has had a number of harvesting operations on the property. They've filed roughly 8 cutting plans since 1995. 2011 was the most recent harvest. I was very much involved with that. And in that amount of time, they've harvested approximately 600,000 to 700,000 board feet, or 600 to 700 cords. Just sort of a little note. A lot of people can't visualize that. 1 board foot is 1 foot by 1 foot, 1 inch thick, and so imagine upwards of 700,000 of those. And then another sort of frame of reference would be a 2,000 square foot home framing and such would be approximately 15,000 board feet. So you could basically say that of the harvest off of Bidwell House, it's gone into roughly 40 homes. And another sort of way of thinking of it in terms of cords for the lower value wood is that a home could use about 10 cords of wood to heat the home through the course of the winter. So with all that, they've actually produced quite a bit of local wood products off of this property. And in that process, since I became active with the board, I encouraged them to make use of some of our state funding. And in 2019, they applied for and were granted funds from the Massachusetts Forest Stewardship Program to develop a comprehensive forest management plan. And those are also available to private landowners out there if anybody's interested. So next slide, you can contact me to talk with you about that, what forest management planning is. So the main elements that were the result of the forest stewardship plan that was developed by Peter Tucker and Adam Brown are the main goals that the museum established are listed here, and they've already actually completed a number of them. They've expanded the trail network. Last year, we unveiled the Loon Brook, which is almost completes a loop around the property. And they've probably the biggest and most impressive was that they also have a permanent conservation restriction now on the property held by the Berkshire Natural Resources Council and the Monterey Preservation Land Trust. And then some of the other elements were to look at the forest and try to enhance habitat for specifically birds, identify any areas that may have invasive plants and look into controlling them, and also reclaiming some of the historic features in the property, like an orchard that's just off the field near the museum. But one of the things that I noticed from the early stages of walking around Bidwell was the amount of ash that we have, particularly in and near the Bidwell House Museum itself and along the trails. And so that was factored into that forest management plan to keep an eye out for that. As of 2019, they had not documented it, so it wasn't in the plan, but it's something that as foresters working in this area, we had seen it in the surrounding towns, and it was coming. And so we go to the next slide. In the fall of 2020, I was preparing for a hike around the property, and unfortunately saw this tree along the Royal Hemlock Trail, and I cut out that bark just to kind of get a peek under it. And so what you see are the galleries of the emerald ash borer. There's serpentine, circuitous in nature, and they are really good at killing ash trees, unfortunately. If you look at the outer side of the bark, you can see the gray is the undisturbed bark, and the blonded appearance is from woodpeckers feeding on the bark. And so that was what cued me into this tree as being suspect for infested with EAB, and unfortunately it is. And so once trees are infested with this exotic insect, it takes approximately 2 to 4 years for them to be killed. And so it's a concern with having a high number of ash trees along the infrastructure of the Bidwell House Museum, along the trails, and the roads. It's also why you're seeing a lot of tree harvesting and tree cutting happening along our roadways and along the power lines. They're aggressively trying to cut back these trees in anticipation of them dying. So this harvest was designed with the reality of knowing that we have this insect coming, and that we're kind of forced with a decision. It's perfectly fine for people to not take any action and let the trees die on their own and fall where they may. That wasn't with the goals and objectives of the museum. They were really concerned about safety along the trails, and that there's real value in these trees. And so part of this harvest is to also celebrate these trees and capture what we can. We utilize this lumber. Ash is a wonderful tree to work with, and it really gives me a heavy heart to see this tree being lost from our landscape. But I'm also told it'll be a temporary disturbance, and there are optimism for a quicker turnaround for this species, but it's going to be beyond our immediate future. It will be at least multiple decades out, is what they're predicting. So if we go to the next slide, just kind of have a few shots of some trees that have come down in recent years from high wind events. And so those are the main concerns that we want to address, particularly near the structures of the Bidwell House Museum and the trails. And with all of these ash trees dying and declining more or less at the same time, what I've also seen is when they are killed quickly, the first thing that tends to go is the root systems. And so a lot of these trees will fail at their base. And so you effectively have a tree that's not necessarily going to be a standing snag for a long time, which is great for wildlife habitat, but will be falling over wherever it may be, and it can be quite damaging. So if we go to the next slide, this is something to think about. The harvest in 2012 did have quite a visual and aesthetic impact to a lot of folks that use the property. Many people don't understand harvesting, and there's a lot of emotional connection with our trees. And so we had a lot of pushback from the community and folks that use the property, just not really understanding what was happening in 2012. And so part of this process we're doing now is to hopefully reach out to the community, get some feedback from you all, and not have this be a decision made behind closed doors. This is the property for the public to enjoy and utilize, and we don't want there to be any surprises. And so if you look at the comparison between these two pictures, it's along the Royal Hemlock Road. It's right north of the museum. One on the left is from 2012. Frankly, it looks kind of messy. I've been around it my entire working life, so I guess I'm kind of used to it. But it does change, and so for every growing season beyond harvest, it heals. And if you look at the picture on the right, there's been a regrowth of the forest. There's dense seedlings and saplings out there. If you go to the next slide, this is also another feature on the property to kind of give you a comparison of what to expect. Now, the density of the ash out there is not going to be quite as intensive of a harvest as the one that was in 2012. But it is going to have a visual effect, and they're really trying to minimize that. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll be passing this off to Peter Tucker and Adam Brown, who have designed this timber sale with their expertise, and we're hopeful that they'll be able to have this harvest completed and possibly even generate some revenue for the Bidwell House that they can use to reinvest back into the property. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Peter and Adam. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Tom. My name is Adam Brown. As was introduced earlier, I'm one of the consulting foresters. I'm going to talk a little bit about the forest cutting plan and kind of how that gets generated and what it means. And then after about 5 slides, Peter's going to pick up with some other details on the project. As Tom mentioned, and rightly so, this all begins with good planning, and that comes in the form to start of a forest stewardship plan, which we did in 2019 for the property. And in that plan, and all those plans that are done, they generate management suggestions. And out of that, Tom reviewed a few of those, but out of that, we identified ash as a potential problem for this pest that we have, that emerald ash borer. And so whenever the Bidwell House decided they want to move forward with this project, we move into what's called a forest cutting plan. And the forest cutting plan is required by state law under Chapter 132, the Forest Cutting Practices Act, in order to remove a commercial volume of wood, which is defined as greater than 25,000 board feet. And so this harvest does indeed remove, or is going to remove that much woods, or more than that, considerably more than that. So we wanted to make sure that we do everything right, and the forest cutting plan kind of lays that out and how it's going to happen. So Tom kind of hinted at it earlier, but the DCR is kind of becomes the agent that oversees a project like this once a cutting plan is filed, and that allows the landowner to go through DCR and the Town Conservation Commission to undertake this harvest. And Tom, or in this case, his counterpart Pete Grima in North Berkshire County, will be overseeing this harvest. They basically are there to enforce or to oversee and make sure that Wetlands Protection Act is followed, and all legal concerns related to the harvest are being addressed. So basically, if you go through the forest cutting plan, probably the most salient part of it addresses what we call best management practices, and these are ways that the landscape is protected, ways that we practice good forestry through these methods. And there are several options that are listed on the forest cutting. It could be stream crossings would be denoted, wetland crossings would be denoted. If there's any cutting going to be happening in wetlands, any filter strips along sensitive areas. And remarkably, the way we've set this harvest up, none of those things are at play. So that's good. It means that we've set up this harvest in a way that is avoiding those sensitive areas on the property. And that was our intention from the get-go. And as far as who's going to do the cutting, it remains to be seen yet. You can see on slide 10 here, the licensed timber harvester at the bottom right on the white part, it says TBD, or to be determined. And that'll get set up after this cutting plan is approved and we decide to move forward. I'm sure Peter will talk about this a little bit more, but the main goal with the timber harvester is to get somebody who is the right fit for and has the right equipment mix to cut this specific property. So as far as types of trees to be cut and volume, there's two kinds of logs that will be coming out. There's saw timber, which is greater than 12-inch diameter trees, and there's firewood and pulp, which are less than 12 inches in diameter. And as we've noted, the main point of the harvest is to sanitize the ash that is potentially infected or is already infected with emerald ash borer. That's about 87% of the marked trees in this sale, which equates to about 16 log truckloads or so. There's a few other types of species of trees that are marked as well, and those include black cherry, which is about 5% of the marked trees, which would equate to about a truckload. There's also some red oak, and which is about 4% of the trees marked, and then a little bit of red maple, white pine, and sugar maple. And although it is focused on ash, the main point is to get those ash out of there, and inevitably there will be some damage to residual trees. We've tried to in our layout to make sure that we are, if we're going to cut an ash tree that is right next to kind of a poorly formed or diseased other tree, we remove that other tree as well to facilitate the removal of that ash. Peter may talk about this a little bit more later as well. So I also mentioned firewood, which is measured in cords. And for those of you that heat with wood, you know that what a cord looks like stacked up, 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, 8 feet long, about 128 cubic feet. So you can, or exactly 128 cubic feet. You can visualize what one cord might look like. This cut plans to remove just under 19 cords firewood and pulp, mostly firewood. So I think, one of the most important aspects of a forest cutting plan is the desire of the landowner, or the intention of the landowner, to manage their property for long-term stewardship. And that determines many things. It determines which trees will be cut. It would determine which trees will be left. And I think it's worth noting that the Bidwell House has, in many ways, gone the extra mile on this project. Aside from the outreach that they've done, just from the get-go, hiring a forester or foresters, going through the forest stewardship plan process, that it shows their intent, I think, very clearly to do this in a sensitive and, kind of with an eye towards long-term management of their forest and stewardship of their forest. Next slide, please. I tell you what, before I go on, Tom, you have anything you want to add to the forest cutting plan process from DCR's end? Is there anything you want to say that I didn't cover?
No, I think you captured the elements of it. The only thing I would say is if there are endangered species on the property, they would be protected if they have been identified. None to date that the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program is aware of do exist on the property, but in the area that I cover, if they do have that documented habitat, then that program does review the work and make sure that you don't effectively have a take of a species that's rare, threatened, or endangered. So, Dan?
Yeah, that's another good point. Thanks. All right. So in this slide, you can see, as we noted, the primary objective is ash sanitation. And the harvest of ash trees is really, it's not throughout the whole property. Most of them occur in just a few stands on the property. And that yellow circle encompasses the location of where the majority of those trees are. And as Tom noted, there are some popular trails near there that you can see here, and probably many of you have hiked on many times. And we'll be certainly, as we were laying this out, we were certainly taking that into consideration. Anytime you have hiking trails and you're inviting the public in to recreate on your property, you have to keep an eye out to mitigating hazards. And if there is, and there will be a mass die-off of ash if they're left here to the emerald ash borer, and that presents, as Tom said, some kind of grave concerns with hazards of standing trees. So that's one thing to consider, aside from places that are away from the trails, but particularly it's kind of the place where the public intersects with this project the most will be where the trails pass through the harvest area. Next slide, please. So within that yellow circle in the previous slide, there are, I believe, four stands. Yeah, 4 total stands that have densities of ash that we would be removing. The stand 14, which is the yellow highlighted part you see here, which is kind of right in the bend of the Art School Road and Carrington Battelle there. That has the highest density or concentration of the ash trees. And there are, as you can see, it's kind of faint on the map, but there are several trails that pass through there, and stone walls and cultural resources in that area. Next slide, please. And then these areas a little bit to the west, stands 8, 9, and 13, are areas where there are ash trees, but they're in less density than the previous stand 14, and but we will be focusing on these areas as well. This is kind of the core area of the property surrounding the museum and the house there. So again, not too far away from the central part of the museum grounds. Next slide, please. All right. So earlier, just a minute ago, I mentioned the way we fill out essentially the cutting plan and what detail goes into it. But there's a lot of I guess I want to stress there's a lot of thought and forethought that goes into this on the ground by the foresters. So in the forest stewardship plan done in 2019, we kind of got a general idea of how much ash is on the property. But then once the Bidwell House decided to do this project, we went back and took a much more precise inventory of what's there and where it is. And then and we do that simultaneously with marking the trees. And so I'm sure you've seen them. If you haven't, next time you go for a hike, you'll see the trees marked. They're marked in paint at about eye height or breast height. And they're marked with a variety of slash marks or horizontal or kind of semi-vertical slash marks, which denote whether it's saw timber or firewood or pulp. And then they're marked with a spot at the base of the tree, which is kind of our quality control. We can tell, if a harvester cut something they shouldn't. That's how we know whether it was marked or not to be cut. So we went through, did our detailed inventory, marked the trees, and in each case of each tree we mark, several minutes of thought goes into where the tree might fall, which way will it be removed from the area? Are there any trails in the area which it might affect? Other trees that might be affected by a large tree falling? It's almost impossible to do a really surgical job and not damage any other vegetation or trees when you cut a large tree like this. So it's we try to put some thought into all those factors. Now, we may not always be right, but at least that we can we can kind of communicate with the timber harvester through our markings to let them know what we were thinking and what we want them to do. As it notes here in the second bullet point, certainly this is not 100% cut of ash trees. Some trees will be left to serve as wildlife habitat or nesting cavity trees. And the reference to coarse woody debris is trees that are left on the ground as they fall and serve as great wildlife habitat or drumming logs for grouse or food sources. They insects and all manner of things like that certainly pick these things apart as they decay. And those are in turn food for birds and wildlife. And as I mentioned, we also marked not just ash, there's some other tree species marked too in the process of this. And most of those are just by way of, they were diseased trees or trees that had major defects or flaws that would be impacted by or affected by the removal of the ash trees around them. All right, next slide, please. And just a reiteration of the kind of seriousness of having trails in a dense area of trees that will be that will be removed. There's definitely going to be some specific closures of trails while this work is going on. And luckily, myself and Peter Tucker and Tom Ryan will all be on the site frequently to make sure that trails aren't closed unnecessarily or for too long. But it's inevitable that some trails will have to be closed, I think, to the public while the work is going on, just for safety reasons. And I guess the last thing, if you look in the left picture here, there's an ash tree that's marked with a slash. That would be a firewood tree, just as I was talking about the paint marks earlier. And there's some slides later which will give you a better idea of what how those paint marks look in the woods and what they mean. So that's all for me. I'm going to turn it over to Peter now.
Thanks, Adam. And there's not a terrible amount of meat left for me to say, I'm glad to say. A lot of you are from Monterey, and I've got long connections over in Monterey. It was always my mother's nightmare when we were my brother and I were in high school, because we inevitably would form a friendship with somebody from Monterey, which is the furthest town from Alford in the school district. So it always meant a 30+ minute drive to get to a friend's house on the weekend. So this this particular slide showing the trails is a good transition into what I'm needing to speak about, because indeed the whole project is a challenge because of the proximity to the museum, the density of the trail network where the cutting area is, and the density of the historic stone wall network that's in this very same area. So it's difficult to fell trees and without disturbing something and without creating some aesthetic detriment, if you will. Those of us, as Tom mentioned earlier, foresters get used to looking at logging debris, and to us, I mean, we know that over time, it decays, goes back into the ground. It's a healthy replenishment of the soil, organic matter, carbon storage. So we come to think of it in that way, and foresters look at projects in long terms because trees grow slowly, things happen relatively slowly in the forest. You look at something in a particular year and come back 5 years later, it may not look much different, even though there's been some diameter growth on the trees and so forth. But nonetheless, the challenge for this project is largely the proximity to all of this structure, all of this network of stone walls, trails, and other historic features, cellar holes, and so forth. Next slide, please. So the scope of the plan, this is a copy of the cutting plan with color enhanced to show red where the logging trails or skid roads where we would move timber out to a log trucking site. To back up, the yellow is again the harvest area. And if you were to compare this map to any of the earlier maps had a somewhat larger area highlighted in yellow. And when we got out to do marking within the stands, what we really encountered were kind of nested areas of density with more frequency of ash trees. So that's what's happening here. There's a little area over the farthest area to the right, just to the east of Art School Road, heading up to the museum, has been added in to the original plan simply because we missed, as we went in and out doing our work, we noticed there were just a scattering of ash trees over there. And there's an existing log landing that was used 10, 15 years ago, which makes it very easy to get at that and harvest those small number of ash trees in that area. You'll notice a green wedge or trapezoid, or not a trapezoid, a polygon. That is one area where we identified that will open up at least a narrow vista corridor looking southerly. Early on, we'd kind of hoped, and I know Rob had hoped too, that the density of ash trees being removed closer to the museum would kind of line up, and we might even be able to achieve a vista right from Bidwell House southerly to the mountain ranges going into Connecticut. But that, as we marked, we found out there were still a lot of good healthy trees other than ash in that zone. And we really didn't think it right to try to open up a long corridor just for vista purposes. But this will give us potentially a narrow vista from one of the trails and gives a good vantage point. So again, Adam was speaking of the component of the harvest. And yes, it's primarily ash, but there are other things. And the reason we're taking some other trees is mainly because they're either in the way or poor quality trees of other species that should be taken for silvicultural purposes to open up maybe a small canopy gap to complete the gap and let the sunlight hit the ground and encourage some regeneration. Next slide, please. So here's a few examples. Both of these pictures have a large ash that's marked, and in the right side, it's the one that's just partly showing with a big orange mark on it. And the other tree is either in the left side, it's a small sugar maple, right side, I think that's a red maple, both marked with a firewood slash. And both have defects, or I should say, at least the one on the right had a significant defect, and both are in the felling direction of the ash tree. So the ash tree is going to want to land on the other tree in both cases. So that's just an example. Next slide, please. And again, more defective trees that are in the proximity of ash trees. Red maple with a hollow in it, decayed in some heart rot. And on the right side is a small sugar maple tree with a sugar maple borer scar. The sugar maple larva tunnels again in the cambium layer and results in a defect that may not kill the tree, but usually causes a deformity and a weak point where sometimes late, years past, and the tree will oftentimes break when the scar is as significant as this one is. Next slide, please. And more trees with disease. These are both cherry with black knot disease. And black knot can form on the trunk of the tree or on the small branches. Sometimes you'll see a crown of a cherry, particularly when there's no foliage, as now. That's just loaded with tiny little black knots in the twigs. And but oftentimes the black knot canker will form on the trunk, and as it grows, it effectively kills tissue and forms a weakness, which it either effectively girdles at the canker, or forms a weakness, and then the stem of the tree snaps at the canker. Next, please. And just before I start speaking of operational considerations, we talked a little bit, or I think Adam mentioned regeneration also. So we're concerned about getting regeneration, but we also have a lot of advanced regeneration from previous cuttings. So depending on where you are in a given stand, if the tree canopy is dense and the ground is very heavily shaded, generally tends to be much less regeneration. Some of the areas, particularly off to the bottom left in stand 13, there was rather substantial cutting. I think it was intended to be a shelter wood cut 10, 15 years ago. And there's quite a bit of oak in that area, but where there was enough thinning and the sunlight came through, there's rather heavy regeneration, rather dense regeneration of sapling sized, mainly birches, black birch, some yellow birch, a little bit of white birch, not much oak. I'm sure they would have liked to have oak regenerate, but it's a difficult thing to hit the timing right to get ground disturbance from the harvesting, which the acorns want to regenerate. They want to be sitting on the soil, not on top of the leaf duff. And the other thing that's competing for the acorns, of course, is everything under the sun in the wildlife world, particularly deer and turkey, but also anything from blue jays to foxes to bears and small rodents. We were working on a cut in during the winter that had quite a bit of had a good fall of acorns last fall, but the logger noted that there was many as 30 turkeys in there at a time during the winter, particularly after some of the harvesting was scraping the soil, and they were taking advantage of easier game of the acorns. Also the deer, there were many, as I think he said, as many as 30 or 40 deer one day, and they were pawing the ground for the acorns as well. So it's a tough job to get regeneration, particularly oak, because one needs the right seed bed, the right timing, acorns available, and with any luck at all, not too many things competing, not too many wildlife creatures competing and removing the acorns before they have a chance to sprout, take root. We're lucky to have an ongoing regeneration study. Dr. David Orwig from Harvard Forest contacted Tom, knowing Tom's role as a service forester, and asked him for different areas that Tom knew of that had cuttings, perhaps 10 years ago. And he particularly wanted to look at whether or not ash was regenerating and what was happening. And he wanted to set up some permanent plots to watch that over a long period of time. So last summer, he and a crew of grad students put out some sample points that are all GPS located, so they can find them easily. They're all marked with little pieces of PVC pipe. So they'll be watching particularly for ash regeneration. And some of those sample points are purposefully in our cutting area. So with any luck at all, we'll see some good results regeneration wise. And we hope that some of it will be ash. So operational considerations, there's always some disruption in removing timber, skid trails, using pre-existing skid trails. We're lucky that we have some network there that we can reuse, and then designing other places, for instance, near the parking lot, is going to be, again, a challenge, but we're just pre-planning routes that not only take advantage of the topography and generally avoid wet spots and purposefully line up with existing barways and stone walls, or cross stone walls where the walls are in disarray, they're disorganized, loose stone, scattered stone, and rather than disrupting one of the more, some of the more beautiful, higher hand-laid, well-crafted sections of stone wall. And you can see the blue stars. Those are 4 existing landing areas that we will reuse. 2 of them are down Carrington Battelle Road. One of them is right close to the parking area in the meadow. And then one on the east side of Art School Road, which is, and again, is an existing log landing. And luckily that's away from existing trails, and is not a challenge or issue on that side. So slash if for loggers and foresters is all that debris from the tree crown, all the limbs that don't get taken away. Those get cut close to the ground. Generally, we'll probably have a lopping standard of 3 feet, and then within perhaps 50 feet of the walking trails, any slash would be left further lopped down to within 2 feet of the ground. And trails, walking trails, do not need to be used for skidding purposes. We will have to cross walking trails in a few places to make this work. But at the end, all of those trails, or excuse me, the skid trails that are used for removing logs will be restored with small equipment, primarily a small excavator, which seems to do the neatest job of smoothing things up. And optionally, we've posed that maybe even volunteers may want to do a little work along trails and perhaps stack some of the leftover slash into brush piles, which has a good habitat value. So a lot of I've noticed there's a lot of songbirds, even when the pile is not used for nesting or denning of small animals, which it could be. Brush piles serve as insect gleaning sites. A lot of the smaller diameter branches tend to lose their bark fairly quickly once they're cut from the tree, and the little folds of peeling bark harbor a lot of different insects. And I've noticed a lot of activity on brush piles for songbirds. Next slide, please. So schedule, that's our changing climate has made things very challenging for foresters and loggers. We've had a lot of winters that end up being rainy or have a very short solid freeze period, and then go back to being above freezing or possibly rainy for a period. And then if we get a late freeze, like we had last week, for instance, 2 or 3 days in a row of teens or down below, 10, 15 degree weather, that's not enough to put frost back into the ground. So it doesn't help in any way in firming the ground for logging. So we're always looking for the stable ground conditions, and that is, whenever the ground is relatively dry, or when there are freezing conditions, so that when equipment operates and brushes the snow off, the frost can get into our skid roads and make a hard surface to run on. So the forest soils almost never freeze on their own, but particularly if there's snow cover. So even if we have snowy conditions and deep freeze, frost doesn't go in generally until you brush the snow away with logging equipment and expose the road surface, the wood road or skid trail surface, and then then things can freeze in. But it just seems that in recent years the period when we get frozen ground is pretty small, so we've oftentimes had to rely more on the non-winter months, the mid and late summer, early fall. Unfortunately, you get spring, you usually get a heavy wet season in March and April. And then sometimes in the fall, just about the times that the leaves drop, tends to be a fall mud season, which again kind of effectively suspends the logging season. So it'll be challenging in all ways to get in at the right time, and also not disrupt, for instance, the heaviest summer season of the museum, and particularly when there's some outdoor events like the summer gala. And I think Rob mentioned there's even a few events slated. Otherwise, maybe even private events. So we'll be working very carefully in scheduling. We can use the area off Carrington Battelle Road without greatly disturbing museum events. But as we noted earlier, there's a great ash concentration closer to the museum and closer to the parking area. So we're still left with a challenge of working that tight area at the right time. And let's see, is there a next slide, or are we done with that segment? All set. So on we are for for question and answer period. So back to Heather, I believe.
Unmute. Okay, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see if we have any comments. So I don't have any questions in the chat. If anybody who's on here has any questions or they want to ask in person, feel free. I think that, you know, the Tom and Peter and Adam have done a really good job of communicating everything that's going on and potentially will be going on. But does anyone have any questions? Wow, you guys did such a great job covering every. Oh, here's Janet. Okay, I hear you, Janet.
Thanks. One thing I was researching, you know, the chestnut blight and everything around here. And one of the things I read is that whereas the Forest Service at that time had recommended taking down all the chestnuts, in retrospect, people wondered if that was a good idea, because if there was some resistance in the populations that would not have, you know, been passed down. I was just wondering if you had thought about that at all.
So are you speaking with respect to the ash?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, you know, there is any possibility of resistance to the ash borer, if any trees survive the infestation, and whether, you know, they might somehow develop a resistance to it. Also, I was curious, sort of related, about your saying that you're hoping the ashes regenerate. I mean, is the idea that by the time they get bigger, we'll have a cure for the ash borer, or how will we expect these new ones to survive?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. In terms, the first part of it, making the analogy with the chestnut, just to make the distinction, chestnut blight's a disease, emerald ash borer is an insect. But you're right, there still could be some, perhaps some sort of a propensity for certain trees to be less susceptible. And whether that is because of genetics or perhaps even isolated location. I've always thought that if for instance, you could find ash trees that were quite isolated, surrounded by other species, that perhaps you get lucky and the borer wouldn't find it, number one, and it would live on and be a potentially reproducing tree, and in that regard, survive. The hard part has been with the experience and observation, Forest Service and others. The emerald ash borer infestation started many years ago, near Michigan, I believe, and moved gradually into New England. We saw it first around 2012 in Dalton in a trap, I guess. And but it's moved fairly consistently and completely in all of the areas that has infested. And most, I've heard several people say, and I think it's a Forest Service measurement, that virtually 99% of ash have succumbed in infested areas. So the probability seems small. I never give up. I always feel that even if I'm in an infested area, if there's particularly an isolated tree, it's more difficult to get to harvest if we're just trying to get some value over what would be lost, or mitigate. In Bidwell House Museum's case, it's even a greater concern to mitigate the hazard trees that will form, that will the hazardous condition that'll be rendered by the dying trees. The fact that they're so close to all of the trail network, the old meeting house site, the old cellar hole, all of the cultural resources and in visitor draw points, makes it important to anticipate the demise of the ash, and particularly since there's potentially some value to be had in harvesting them now, whereas once they die, it becomes very expensive to deal with removing them near trails and so forth. And just letting them fall jackstraw and potentially being a liability to visitors is the real, the huge problem. Not so much, getting a little bit of money or a modicum of money before they die. It's just an efficient way of getting the work done, essentially, to mitigate the hazard. So I've stepped round and round in a circle, and Tom and Adam may have other things to add to that. But my personal view is, leave a few ash all the time, because, and particularly the smaller, healthy-looking ones, even in an infested area, because maybe to your point, maybe it is the case that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 will survive, and no big deal about harvesting every one of them, for sure. We'd like to leave some, and if they die, they have some habitat value, they have some soil rebuilding value, always. And if they don't die, then that's a huge bonus in my eye.
One thing I could add to that is that there are treatments for emerald ash borer, but the problem is that they're only applicable on like a single tree basis. So, if you had an ash tree in your yard and it became infested, there is recourse, but it doesn't apply on a landscape level. It becomes prohibitively expensive to do any sort of treatment that's out there at the moment. That being said, I know that researchers from various universities are working on the issue, but right now, as far as I know, there's not anything that's completely effective at the landscape level. Maybe Tom could correct me if he has more current information.
Well, and what they are trialing right now is releasing some natural predators for emerald ash borer that were purportedly vetted from Asia as well, and that they're not going to cause another problem here. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But that, I think, is the hope and the positive sense that I've gotten from most of the forest health folks that I've talked to, that they feel like being an insect and it's got a very specific host, that there is much more promise for bringing ash back into our landscape, in a quicker amount of time. Nobody can really predict when, but they feel like it won't be as bad as the chestnut situation. So, and like we had noted before, there is still a lot of ash scattered um, throughout the forest, which is not intended to be cut with this harvest. And beyond the borders of Bidwell, there's a lot of ash in our forest that just won't be harvested. So if there is a chance for some genetic resistance, which we haven't really seen yet, I think that the numbers are there, that we're not harvesting all of the ash. Does that answer most of your questions, Janet?
It does, yeah, thank you.
All right, so Frank has his hand up. Frank, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. First, thank you guys for a great presentation. It was really thorough and very interesting. I was just wondering, is there a certain, with the ash borer, is there a certain age at which the trees are attacked, or the borer just goes for young and old trees alike?
It's more of a size. So I believe it's 2 inches diameter is what I've heard. Am I right in that, Peter and Adam? So something that's roughly about, a 2-inch diameter sapling and larger is likely to be affected or infested. What I do see in early stages is that it generally starts in the upper canopy and works its way down the bole of the tree. So generally, once you start seeing the borer in the actual stem on the lower part of the tree, then the infestation's starting to progress quite substantially.
And that blonding that Tom's referring to is woodpeckers getting at the larvae. That's what you see. It's not the effect of the pest, it's the effect of the things that eat the pest.
Yeah. And I guess, from my observations of the area, I felt very optimistic for a little while. Like Monterey, Sandusfield, Tolland, Marlboro seemed to be kind of like a little oasis that wasn't affected yet. I have family down south of us in Connecticut, and north of us, I was seeing ash declining rapidly, and then unfortunately I did find it in 2020. So the progression that I have seen in nearby is a fairly rapid decline of the ash, and it's the once you tune your eye into the woodpecker activity, you can kind of get a sense of just how extensive ash is present, particularly along our roadways, and how much the infestation is progressing with the emerald ash borer.
And to tag onto that, Peter, Tom noted that he noticed it and take an uptick in this area in 2020, and that corresponded with a very dry summer. And ash have a whole host of other challenges too, diseases, and that a dry summer like that can really kick off, it can weaken them and kick off an infestation like this. If it wasn't happening right here, it did shortly thereafter because of stress on the trees in 2020 particularly.
Great. All right, so next up, Sam Miller, you have had your hand up, and then we'll go to Steve Moore.
Yeah. Also, thank you all very much. Let's see, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Are you hearing feedback?
Yeah.
I'm going to do this by chat. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm going to do this by chat. Sorry.
Okay. All right. I think Sam's going to ask his question by chat. Maybe Steve, do you want to ask your question? Oh,
Sure.
geez.
Can you hear me? I was particularly interested, I hadn't heard this before, Tom, when you said that the root base on the trees seems to die. I guess it decomposes. So it makes the tree more likely to fall over. And I've imagined that, you know, a lot of trees will die up in the canopy and can stand for a considerable period of time. But now it sounds like for instance, as it happens, Adam and Peter were over our property walking it just a couple of weeks ago, and we have quite a few ash along our driveway, for instance. And I thought we would maybe be able to get away with leaving them as standing deadwood for quite a while. So it's not unusual for the ash to just topple over sort of earlier on.
And I think that was an anecdotal observation on my part. I've got an echo in here. Sorry about
Bad
that.
boy.
Not me.
Steve, Stephen, I think that's yours. We
Yeah,
have to
Steve,
mute
why don't you
yourself.
mute? Yeah, Steve, why don't you mute?
So up around my office building, right on the Lennox-Pittsfield line, we documented the borer a while ago. And so as I witnessed the trees declining, it may have also been its exposure, but I was seeing trees die relatively quickly, and then I believe the fungus got into the root systems, the secondary fungi, and they decomposed the roots and then compromised that structure. So so that was an observation. I can't back that up with any science per se, other than what I've seen. So I think if you have the ash that are going to be dying rapidly, then maybe pay attention to where it's located. If it's going to have a lot of wind on it, then that would be something that would be more concern. Whereas if it's protected with surrounding trees, it may have a better chance of standing and providing some habitat value. I think we got Samuel Miller's question now.
Yes, so Sam's asked if an infested tree can still be used for firewood or lumber, whether we cut it down or if it falls, is his first question.
Yes, if more generally speaking, once the tree dies, it will rapidly decline in value from a commercial standpoint. So people that are buying ash would prefer it to be still alive. Once the tree dies, it gets fairly rapidly colonized by decomposition fungi that will cause defects in the lumber. But from a firewood standpoint, it's perfectly acceptable. I just this winter, unfortunately, found the emerald ash borer on my property, which is about a mile from Bidwell, and I'm using it for firewood. So.
And then it looks like Sam had another question from the earlier photo of the ash with the bark stripped off. Is the snake-like marking the sign of the infestation? That's
the feeding galleries of the larvae. So as the larvae grows, that's its pattern of how it feeds. And so if you look under the bark while it's still feeding, you'll find very distinctive looking white grubs with a diamond shaped head. And then eventually they do form a beetle and emerge through a D-shaped exit hole.
Okay. And then Sam has one more question. He says they live at the bottom of Carrington Battelle. So what would you expect the biggest impact of the forestry for them?
Noise. Probably the noise. Chainsaws are noisy. I use one regularly, and I don't think much of it when I'm using it, but when I had a timber harvest on a neighboring property. It's loud. You know, the harvesting event machinery can be quite loud.
One thing to note, Sam, is that the portions marked along Carrington Bateller are kind of they're not particularly far from the main area that's gonna be harvested either, but it's the lesser portion of the ash, less dense area. So I think you could expect disruption on Carrington Battelle for less time than we would see in the other part, stand 14. But you're going to be able to hear it probably from anywhere. The sound would carry no matter where they were working on the Bidwell House property. I think you would hear that from your house probably.
Probably be a lot similar to some of the tree work that we've had done in the area recently, mainly the chainsaw use. It depends, like some of the heavy equipment can be loud. Some of the skidders, some of the older skidders don't have the best mufflers on them, and they can be really loud. But hopefully we'll get a good operator with a good muffler.
Okay, well, again, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you for the questions. That's great. All right, I don't have any more questions in the chat, so I'll just ask one more time if anyone has any other questions. And again, feel free, if you come out with any questions after this, feel free to call the museum, email me. I can definitely talk to Tom and Adam and Peter. I can share your questions with them. But yeah, like I said, we want everybody to know what's going on. We want to make sure everybody's aware. So, oh, here comes Rob. Rob, do you have a question?
Not really a question, and Heather, maybe you were going to comment or mention it, but that we are planning to host a walk for anybody who would like to see.
Oh, yes.
So you can go ahead and.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. I completely forgot to mention it. So it is on our website. We do want people to register for it just so that we can kind of cap it, no more than, 25 or 30 people. But if you do want to take a walk on the grounds, and I think some of the people on this call are registered for that as well. But if you want to take a guided walk on the grounds to actually look at this places where there will be some cutting, we're going to be doing that in about a week and a half. It's going to be next Saturday, right? A week from Saturday, I think the 9th.
April 9th.
What was that?
10 a.m.
Yes, 10 a.m. on the 9th. Yeah. So, and we have a number of people signed up for that. Some people who couldn't make it tonight. So, but yes, if you want to take an actual look in person of what the cutting will be, what will be happening, you can do that next weekend. So,
actually, one final comment would be when you look at the harvest plan, you'll notice an area that's been identified as a potential vernal pool. It hasn't been certified yet, but what's happening right now is our temperatures have warmed up. We're getting some rain tonight. This is triggering our amphibians to start their breeding, and so they're now moving from uplands down into to these vernal pools for their breeding purposes. And so by the time of that hike, we should be able to investigate that vernal pool, which is protected. In the planning process, there is a buffer around that pool, so we might be able to actually see some egg masses in the pool, which would be kind of neat. And also, if you're driving down Route 57 or 183 this evening, there's going to be some folks out on the road with flashlights and high-vis shirts, escorting the frogs and salamanders across the road, giving them safe passage, being crossing guards for them. So just keep your eyes open on rainy nights like this. This is when they're moving, and they're looking for those special places to breed. So
great.
That's
wow. All right. Well, if we don't have any further questions, I just want to say thank you everyone for attending tonight. Thank you so much, Adam and Peter and Tom, for your presentation. It's just so helpful. Yeah, we'll do a walk in a week and everybody can take a look. Oh, Adam, you have one more question?
Looked like Sam had another question in the chat.
Yes, I saw that. Yes.
That's private.
Yeah, I'm gonna send him some content. I'm gonna send him information tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yep. So we're
Thanks again,
good.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.
You too.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank
Adam.
you. Thank you. A pleasure.